Hello, and welcome back to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy's podcast. As always, the goal of these discussions is to have in depth conversations with experts on current issues facing Canada. Today, we're going to be discussing Canada China relations, and specifically, we want to better understand the bilateral relationship on issues like climate change and environmental protection. We're excited to have Guy Saint-Jacques with us today, who was Canada's former ambassador to China from 2012 to 2016. Previously, Mr. Saint-Jacques worked for Global Affairs Canada for nearly 40 years, serving in Kinshasa, Hong Kong, Beijing, Washington, D.C., and London. He has served as Deputy High Commissioner in London and as Deputy Head of Mission in Washington. In Ottawa, amongst other things, he has worked in the divisions dealing with science and technology and environment and energy in the Associate Deputy Minister's Office and has been Director of Assignments and Director General of Personnel Management. Needless to say, Mr. Saint-Jacques, you have quite a lot of experience in relations to China and the environment. Now, over the past 5 to 10 years, China has increasingly invested more money into the development of green energy and environmentally conscious technology. We've seen this dedication to the environment awareness as recently as 2020, with President Xi Jinping stating that the country will aim to be carbon neutral by 2060. It's clear that there is some mutual interest between Canada and China on the environmental front. However, we also know that the countries differ on many key issues as well. So, with that being said, what is your assessment of Canada's current approach to environmental foreign policy in regards to China? Do you think Canada intends to engage with China on issues like the environment and climate change?
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. As you know, there is a long history of collaboration in the field of environmental policy and climate change with China. I would say thanks to the very good programs that were put in place by the Canadian International Development Agency going back to the 80s. And in fact, there were many very successful projects that took place. Canada was instrumental in helping to create what was called then the Ministry of Environmental Protection in China. And also in the creation of a council to help, a high-level council to help provide advice to the Chinese leadership. And in fact, Canada is still providing the major portion of the funding of this council that is normally co-chaired by the Canadian Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Chinese counterpart. Obviously, right now, I must say that all the official dialogues, all the work that was going on as of early December 2018 has been suspended because of the all the turmoil that has followed the arrest of Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver and then later of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. So it's difficult to assess where will things will move from here. But I would say in any case, Canada has to prepare itself for where we will want to work with China once we are out of this crisis. Of course, the crisis has given the opportunity to see what I would call the dark side of China, a China that has become a lot more assertive and aggressive since Xi Jinping became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China in November 2012. But at the same time, we have to realize that China will not go away. China is likely to become the predominant economy in the world, and China will continue to have an impact on our lives, on our trade, on our economy. And so we have to try to look at how we can engage with China while respecting and protecting our values. And I would say that, in my view, the field of environment offers a good opportunity on one hand to build on the good work and the good reputation of Canada for all the past work done with China, and the fact that if we want to address issues like climate change, we have to help China to address its problem and help it to reduce its emissions, because greenhouse gas emissions travel all over the world, and China is the main emitter of greenhouse gas emission. And so I would hope that there will be, we'll come to the conclusion that this is an area where indeed it's in our interest to work with China. Obviously, for the Canadian government, this will have to be explained to the Canadian public, because the public opinion has become very negative on China because of what is going on in the country. Just to name a few issues, the genocide in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, and on freedom of expression and other issues in China itself.
I think that's a very good point, particularly in terms of engaging China going forward, because it is important that they are at the table in these sort of discussions, particularly the environment, because of how large the population is and how much they consume per year. So I think that is a very, very good point. Sort of building off that, given both Canada and China's national goals of achieving net zero emissions at various time points, what opportunities do you think exist for the two countries to cooperate and work together on the environment and climate change?
I think it's important to remember that, in fact, China has come a long way, because when the economic reforms were launched by Deng Xiaoping in 1978, the focus was on economic development. And over the years, and in fact, Canada again helped China to put in place good laws, but in fact, those laws to protect the environment were not implemented, because all the focus was on growth and only growth. But over time, China started to realize that, in fact, it was paying a price that was increasing over time as the effects of pollution could be seen. And I think that when you couple this with the one-child policy that was in place until 2015, when Chinese parents started to see that their children had more and more respiratory problems, when people could see by themselves that the poor quality of the air, also they went on the site of the American embassy in Beijing to see that to see the hourly ratings of air pollution. At some point, the Chinese government could no longer hide the fact that pollution was exacting a heavy price on the health of people. There was a study that came out also, I think it was in 2014, saying that if you live in the northern part of China, your life expectancy was reduced by 5 years. And there was a major turnaround that happened in October 2013, when Premier Li Keqiang announced that there would be a lot more focus to reduce pollution. There was also a realization that this was having an important impact on the economy. There was a report by the World Bank saying that the impact of pollution resulted on a 5 to 6% impact on the GDP. It was not only the air that was full, but also 70% of the rivers in China were so polluted that you could not use the water for human consumption. 23% of the agricultural land was polluted with heavy metals. And when you add to this the growing evidence that climate change has an impact on China with increasing desertification in the north of the country, more flooding of agricultural land in the central and southern part of the country, also flooding in the coastal areas, I think the government came to the conclusion that they had to act. And to make sure that the message was well understood, inspectors were sent around to judge the performance of local officials, to really send the message that their performance would no longer judge only on economic growth, but also on what they were doing to reduce pollution. And China is faced with a big problem because in terms of its energy, it is heavily dependent on foreign oil. It imports more than 70% of its need for oil. And domestically, they have very large reserves of coal, but this coal is of poor quality. And therefore, the dilemma is how to move away from the use of coal without increasing imports of natural gas or other things. And so the solution to this has been to try to increase rapidly the use of renewable technology like wind and solar. This was difficult at the outset because the utilities that manage the electrical grid in China were reluctant to use the power coming from those renewable sources, saying that it's more difficult to manage. And they prefer, of course, to have a good old coal-fired plant that provides a steady flow of electricity, but the government is forcing them. And so we are seeing rapid progress. And so I would say that when we look at this, and we see this determination on the part of the Chinese government to really take action to reduce pollution and to move towards a renewable technology. They know that Canada offers a very good story in terms of renewable technology. We have a number of companies and expertise. And I think there's been work that has taken place in the past. But if I look at the more recent situation, you have companies like Ballard that have made significant inroads in terms of fuel cells being used in transportation. And China is moving big time on using fuel cells for public transit, buses, and so on. Also heavy transportation. There are also other companies involved in hydrogen production. There are a large Canadian company, Canadian Solar, which is very active in China. And, you know, when I was the chief negotiator for Canada on climate change, I knew the situation in China because I had been there 3 times. That was before I became ambassador to China. I had discussions with the Chinese officials, and I told them, you can do a lot more and to reduce your emissions. And at the time, they were saying that their greenhouse gas emissions would peak by 2030. I said, you have a lot of low-hanging fruits. In fact, this could be in 2025. And what China has been doing is under-promising, but over-delivering. And so I think for Canada, there are lots of opportunities to work with China. Another example is carbon capture and storage. There was lots of interest on the part of China for Boundary Dam 2, which is a 100 megawatt coal-fired project in Saskatchewan, where 90% of the CO2 is captured, and it's sent by a pipeline to increase traditional oil extraction. And I think knowing how much coal is used in China to help them in their transition, in fact, we have to look at ways to help them to put in place projects to capture and store carbon. We have also to help them with all the renewable technology. On this, we had big hopes on hydropower, in the 80s, but in fact, they have developed their own expertise. We could help them as well on the nuclear side. There are two CANDU reactors that operate in China, but in fact, there could be more, because the beauty of the the CANDU reactor is that you can use as fuel the spent fuel coming from light water reactors. So if you take that spent fuel, you burn it in the CANDU, you reduce the amount of nuclear waste that you have to store, and you reduce the amount of uranium that you have to import, because China still imports lots of uranium, including from Canada. So, if we could export liquefied natural gas, I think also it would help China to move away from coal. So when you add all this, I think that there are many opportunities for collaboration.
Sort of my next question would be, in terms of from your time as ambassador to now, how have you really seen the relationship with China and Canada change since then? Because I think a lot of people have highlighted that the past 5 years have seen a very large shift in Canadian-China relations.
Well, by the time I left China in October 2016, it's just over 4 years ago, we had succeeded in putting in place very useful mechanisms for all kinds of high-level dialogues on all the main sector of the relationship, and that would include, of course, political issues, annual meetings between the prime ministers, between the foreign affairs minister. We had the economic and financial dialogue that involved the Minister of Finance on our side and a Vice Premier on the Chinese side. And we had also this collaboration on the environmental sector that was going very well. But the reality at the same time, we have to be humble, and we have to realize that Canada is not very influential with China. We used to be more influential, but in fact, especially in the 80s and 90s, when we were running our development assistance program, where we spent more than $1 billion. And, when I traveled in China, when I was ambassador, everyone would tell me how great this collaboration, and they were very grateful for Canada. But then other countries also started to pay more attention, and we fell behind. Right until the end of 2017, the hope of China was to sign a free trade agreement with Canada. In fact, we came very close to launching the official negotiations when Mr. Trudeau went to Beijing on his second trip in December of that year. Unfortunately, the two sides could not agree on the wording of the communique announcing the launch. And in fact, now that we have signed the new version of the U.S., the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, there's a clause there, 30-10, that for all practical purposes mean that there will be no free trade agreement. And so I think after that, China started to lose interest, more interest in Canada. And so we are in this situation now where there was less interest, and then just over 2 years ago, happened this big problem following the arrest of Mrs. Meng. And so I would say that things have deteriorated in the last few years. But this being said, I think that Canada is still very well perceived in China due to the fact of this past collaboration. We're established to establish a very good basis. Many Chinese leaders have sent their children to Canada to be educated. In fact, Canada is one of the 4 main destinations of Chinese students abroad. They like the quality of Canada, and I had many discussions with Chinese parents when they compare with the United States. They saw Canada as a much better country. The number of Chinese tourists also coming to Canada kept increasing year after year, and so just before the COVID-19, Chinese visitors were the second largest source of overseas visitors. So I think that once we are out of the crisis, we will have to proceed gradually to rebuild confidence. It's clear that the engagement strategy will have to be a lot more selective, but I would argue that again, there are a number of issues where we need to work with China. Of course, we are discussing in the environment, but I would add also that if we want to control the opioid crisis in Canada, we need to get more collaboration from China to reduce or stop the shipment of fentanyl to Canada. So, so that means that, and also public health issues and pandemics will require collaboration. It's in our interest, obviously, to help China to manage better the eclosion of future pandemics.
Yeah, and I think particularly touching on COVID-19 and the sort of people-to-people relations with China, as you kind of pointed out, there's a lot of international students in Canada. Over 190,000 of them are Chinese students. And I sort of building on, the amount of tourists and stuff we have coming from China, as well as the students, what role do you think students and Chinese tourists play in that relationship, and how can their exchange of knowledge in general, people-to-people relations, really benefit the overall Canada-China relationship?
Yeah. Well, I think that, we Canadians are nice by nature, and we are not too calculating, but I think we have lost an opportunity not being more strategic in the way that we manage our relations with Chinese who have been exposed to Canada. And as you mentioned, I have had 2 postings to the United States. In fact, we should look at what we have done in the United States in terms of outreach and of course, it's the relationship with the US is much more important, but there are similarities in as much as you are dealing with 2 giants, China and the United States, where you understand that you are the junior partner and you have to make more efforts to get noticed. But in this regard, I think that especially for Chinese who have been educated, and now we are talking, of hundreds of thousands of people, we should do more to reach out to them once they are back in China. And in this regard, when I was ambassador, I spoke with presidents of large Canadian universities, and I said, why don't you create alumni association and focus on these people? Because also many of these people have been very successful. This could be interesting in terms of donations, possible donations for your activities, and of course to convince these people to send their children to Canada. But in a way, and this applies also to senior officials who have been trained by Canada. If we could have built a database and be able to follow people, this was one of my frustration when I would go in China and meet a senior leader in Guangdong province, and this person would tell me, I studied at Waterloo and it was great, and it was the first time I heard about that. We didn't know, and so and with modern means, we should be able to track down people, to follow their career, and use social media as we do in the United States to reach out to key people, and and look at ways to involve them in the relationship. So this is a big project, but I think that it would pay off in terms of building on those people-to-people relations.
Yeah, and I think you definitely highlighted a very good point in terms of building that connection based on, personal connections that people have through school. It's a very important, I think, aspect of not just the political side of it, but sort of the overall discussion of relations between the countries, because it also stems down to individuals at kind of a basic grassroots level of just people interacting with people. Um, I'm going to touch on the two Michaels a little bit, just because they are a big part of Canada-China relations right now. And are you optimistic about the potential solution to the two Michaels case? And do you think that there is a way to kind of secure the release of the two Michaels without resolving the Meng Wanzhou extradition case? Because a lot of people have tied those two together.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic. And, right from the beginning of the crisis, I spoke with people in Ottawa to try to help them understand where China is coming from. And I said, this will go on for a long time. And the key, of course, is what happens to Mrs. Meng. And, the Chinese have told us that as long as Mrs. Meng is not returned to China, well, in their words, we won't get back to normal relations. But I would say that the federal government, I think, has come to the realization late last year that the engagement strategy that had been followed, and to be nice and to hope that common sense would prevail, was going nowhere. Our two Canadians, and I must say that I know Michael Kovic very well, because I was the one to recruit him to work in Beijing. I had the pleasure of working with him 2 years. Great officer. And also Michael, when he was arrested, knew right away what was facing him, because when he was at the embassy, that was at the time where we went through a similar case, in as much as Kevin and Julia Garrett, two Canadian missionaries that had been in China for about 30 years, were arrested in August 2014. Following, a similar thing, we had arrested a Chinese citizen called Su Bin in Vancouver. The U.S. Department of Justice wanted him to be extradited to the U.S. And when I went to meet with Chinese officials, they would tell me, you return Mr. Su Bin and good things will happen to the Garretts. Eventually they release Julia, but the case of Kevin, he had this trial and he was sentenced, and it was just before he was sentenced that during the first visit of Mr. Trudeau to China, we were able to negotiate his release. We have just heard yesterday that there was an article in the Global Times, which is the English paper in one of the English papers in China, but very close to the Communist Party, saying that their trial will start soon. This is bad news in as much as, well, of course, in China, once you are formally charged, you are found guilty more than 99% of the time. But also, once their trial starts, it will become very difficult to extract them. And I went through this with Kevin Garrett, because the Chinese were telling me, don't you know that China is a country governed by the rule of law? Don't ask us to intervene into a legal process. And according to Chinese rules, and in fact, their trial should have started much earlier, because they have not followed their guidelines on timelines. But they say, well, there was the COVID. But I think also they were waiting to see if the negotiations that we heard about in December that were taking place between the U.S. Department of Justice and the legal team of Mrs. Meng would lead to anything. And they are following the hearings that are taking place in Vancouver. And I thought that they would have waited for a decision of the judge. But now, we are stuck in this big game between the United States and China. There's a new president, Mr. Biden in Washington, who has said that he is creating this new Council of Democracies. The first meeting will be in April, and that's to oppose China, because China is perceived as a strategic competitor. Next week, on Thursday, there will be in Alaska the first meeting between Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan with Wang Yi, the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Yang Jiechi, who is the State Counselor for Foreign Affairs in China. The State Counselor is higher up in the hierarchy than the minister. And I think it's a message also that the U.S. that China is sending to the U.S. If you want to resolve the case of the two Canadians, you have to make concessions on Guangzhou. But coming back to the timelines, once, and I wouldn't be surprised if the trial starts next week. The Chinese have to give 3 days notice to the Canadian government that the trial will start, but then it will take between 2 and 6 months. It can be extended if the Supreme Court of China agrees, but this means that we could have a decision, I would guess, in September, October. They will be sentenced, probably a very harsh sentence. And so, and Mrs. Meng will still be most likely in Canada. She will appeal if there is a decision to extradite her to the United States. And so that means for Canada, it's almost an impossible situation, because we know the federal government will not intervene, will not send back Mrs. Meng to China. And I think for very valid reasons. Canada is a country governed by the rule of law, and you don't want to interfere in the legal process that is ongoing. The accusations brought by the U.S. Department of Justice are serious. And so that means that unless there is a solution that comes from Washington, I'm afraid that we will be going through another long period of difficult relations with China, which will complicate all the engagement proposal. I think it would be very difficult for the Canadian government to engage in lots of projects related to the environment while our two Canadians are still in jail. And in any case, I think that the Chinese would refuse to engage with us because, we are in the doghouse. And so I hope that a solution can come from Washington, but it's pretty sad for the two Michaels, what's happening now.
Do you think resolving this situation would be enough to stop the deterioration of the Canada-China relationship? Or do you think that the current sort of downward trend that you've highlighted that we're likely to see is non-reversible at this point?
I think that, in the last 2 years, and especially last year, we have learned a lot about what's happening in China. And, I'm convinced that there is a genocide going on in Xinjiang. In fact, there is a crackdown on minorities in China. They are preventing Mongolian language education, Tibetan language education, very harsh in Xinjiang. Also, we have seen what's going on in Hong Kong, what China is doing in the South China Sea, the poor way in which it managed the pandemic at the outset. And I think for all those reasons, it has become very difficult for Western countries to continue to give the benefit of the doubt to China. And I think what is at stake here is fundamental values for democracies. And I think that for all of us, we have to say, well, knowing what we know about what's going on in China, And yes, we all hope to do more business with them, but how will history judge us? And if we don't react, if we let this go and let China manage as it wants, then we better be ready for China to dictate the terms of the relationship. And we know of more and more attempts at interfering in Canadian affairs, trying to limit the debate, for instance, in universities on issues that China finds sensitive or red lines, the situation in Xinjiang in Tibet. And so for all those reasons, I was very pleased when I heard President Biden call for this Council of Democracies, because I think we are at the stage where democracies have to get together, agree on common policies. And the issue, the message to China should be simple. We don't want to contain you, but we want you to be a responsible stakeholder on the international scene. We want you to abide by international laws, stop the weaponization of trade, stop contravening international treaties. And so you have to change your ways. And if we are firm, and if there's another case where China takes people as hostage, and we have common sanctions that are applied at the same time by Western democracy, China will get the message, because China needs a well-functioning international environment, especially on the trade side. 19% of their GDP comes from exports. And if they start to realize that there is a price to pay, I think also this will encourage what I call progressive forces in China that are opposed to the direction that China has taken under Xi Jinping. China is not monolithic. There are factions in the Communist Party. There are academics that dare to criticize Xi Jinping. So if we are forceful and, with the right message and saying we don't want to gang up and contain China, we want it to be a good partner, a responsible stakeholder. Hopefully, this will lead to change. But all this can be very sensitive, because and the main question will be the relationship between the United States and China, and how this will play out over the next few years.
I think that's a very, very good point. And I think the discussion around engagement versus constraining is one that it needs to be discussed, I think, a little bit more, given everything that's happened in the past 5 years with the US, China, Canada, China. They all play a very important role in this sort of complex relationship. I think building off that, given the complexities of the relationship, how do you think Canada can reconcile the need to cooperate with China on environmental protection, climate change initiatives on a global scale and bilaterally, with Canada's concern over issues like human rights in China right now?
Yeah. Well, this in many ways is not a new debate, because I recall during my first posting in the 80s in Beijing, we were concerned about human rights. And I would say that in all the conversations that I listened to during meetings when Mr. Mulroney came on official visit to China, or Paul Martin, or Stephen Harper, or Justin Trudeau, human rights were always mentioned. But I think it has taken a new dimension. And I think that, it was legitimate on our part in the 90s to think that China was going to change in the direction that we thought it should go, gradually more democratic, because they were experimenting with elections at the local level. Zhurongji put in place significant economic reforms to be able to join the World Trade Organization. But what happened after that is that the leadership started to get concerned after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And they learned lessons, and they said we have to avoid that at all costs. And the answer is to crack down on freedom of expression, and then they start to use modern means, modern technology, and now, of course, with algorithm and control, they have become very efficient in controlling freedom of expression in China and cracking down on human rights lawyers and so on. So this is posing a bigger problem now of how to reconcile the protection and promotion of your interests with transgressions done by China on the human rights front. And I think for that, for a country like Canada, it's very difficult to be very forceful on an individual basis, because also the Chinese policy has been to punish countries that dare to criticize it. And I mentioned earlier the using trade as a weapon. You know, we saw this early on in the crisis, where we lost billions of dollars of exports in 2019. And that's why you have to work as a group. In French, we say l'union fait la force. So if you join forces, you are more powerful. And again, it's a question of the message and saying, and using opportunities to say to China, look, we are concerned, and we will continue to challenge you, especially as you have signed covenants related to human rights. And this creates obligations that you are supposed to pay attention to. And similarly, you have to pay attention to decisions of tribunals, for instance, the one that had been set up under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that rendered its decision in July 2016 against China on the South China Sea. The Canadian public will expect the government to be forceful, and so this won't be easy. But again, I think the key is to be in good company and to try to outline to China the consequences of its bad behavior if it doesn't mend its ways.
How do you think China will respond to this strategy of potentially selective engagement? Would Beijing be likely to accept it, or would they be more likely to find other partners in trade or collaboration on the environment, given if, you know, Canada puts a bit of a stronger voice behind its concerns in other sectors?
Yeah, well, the Chinese can be very pragmatic, and sometimes, you know, they have to no choice but to compromise. An example of this is if you look at trade in 2020, well, our exports to China increased by 8%. At a time where overall in the world, our exports went down by 11%. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Well, China had no choice but to resume importing large amounts of canola seeds, canola oil, Canadian pork, because they are faced with problems in their agricultural production following floods. Also, their relationship with the United States and with Australia is not very good. Those are traditional providers of commodities similar to those that Canada can supply. And so that means that, in my view, there will always be a market for Canadian goods and commodities. And of course, the bulk of our exports are commodities. But you're right, on their side, they will not want to engage too much with Canada as long as we have this ongoing problem. But again, if they see that, and the environmental sector is a good example, that in fact, by working with Canada, it can help them to reach their goals faster, and that investment by Canadian companies will create employment in China, then I think they may be amenable to this kind of selective engagement.
Awesome. I think you've highlighted a lot of good points in today's discussion and sort of underscored the need for Canada to have a balanced approach to China, be it in the environment or elsewhere in other sectors. I know we could probably spend hours talking about the complexities of the Canada-China relationship, but we've come to the end of today's discussion, unfortunately. I'd like to thank you on behalf of IPD for joining me today to really highlight the role of environment and the role it can play in this relationship that we have with China. And I hope the listeners also enjoyed today's discussion. Thank you again for joining us today, Mr. Saint-Jacques. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. And thank you all for listening to today's podcast.
Well, thank you very much again for the invitation.